we are devoting the month of February, the Fridays, to the Gnostic Sophia, the Sophia myth, and I thought that this evening will lead up to it by looking at the feminine deities in world history and get a little larger picture. So that's what we will. Can I start? Yes? All right. All right, real good then. Inasmuch as we are introducing now the series of the Gnostic Sophia, it may be useful to recall that the figure of Sophia, the deific lady wisdom, has been known, of course, ever since the 2nd century or so, primarily from the writings of the church fathers, the heresiologist church fathers, people of that description, who of course were not very favorable to Sophia. But the mysterious figure survived the church fathers very nicely, and then later on in history, again and again, we see the figure popping up, being mentioned by people. For instance, a number of esotericists who appeared, like probably a very prominent one being the German esoteric writer right after the time of the Reformation, fairly late, Jakob Böhme, the famous mystic shoemaker of Görlitz, very interesting figure, and he, in his Aurora die Morgenröte, Aurora the sunrise, he mentions Sophia a number of times, although he gives her the Latin name of Sapientia, and similarly, it sort of pops up here and there, just kind of indicating throughout history that she has not been forgotten. Now then, again, when the occult and in part Gnostic revival of the late 19th century came about, which included the foundation of the Theosophical Society, of course, in 1875, and various other events of some importance in that regard, then all of a sudden the Sophia figure appears again, not only in being referred to incidentally, but for the first time a pretty hefty big book was discovered in London in the house of a Dr. Askew, a medical doctor who passed away and had all kinds of unusual books, and there was the book which came to be called Pistis Sophia, Faithful Sophia, in Sahidic Coptic, and containing a great deal of the Gnostic narrative concerning this mysterious figure. Madame Blavatsky was just within the last couple of years of her life when that was discovered, but she commented on it, and she designed a fabulous diagram indicating some sort of various powers in the book Pistis Sophia, and which then has been also been reproduced. So that somewhat brought the figure to the fore a little more. And so those of us who were interested in these things, shall we say, were privy to some of this information. especially when it came to the middle part of the 19th century, where particularly in Russia, the Sophiologist writers, led by Vladimir Solovyov, whose portrait hangs there, and others, started writing about Sophia and brought forward into public view something that was present already but not at all well known, namely that the Russian Orthodox Church primarily had always continued to revere the divine wisdom of God. Those Russian writers, beginning with Solovyov, Berdeyev, and one or two others, who then started writing about her. So let's say there was a sort of a rebirth of interest in Sophia. Now, so it was really only the esotericists and some of the Orthodox theologians, Russian Orthodox theologians, who were mentioning the divine Sophia. But then came the period of the 1960s and thereabouts, when the feminist movement, both in a cultural sense, in a political sense, came to the fore. And then all of a sudden there was a revival of interest in Sophia, which, as one might expect, when such a revival is brought about primarily by people who don't really know too much about who or what they are reviving, turns out kind of weird. And that was true in that case also. But since then, since the 60s phenomenon and so forth, there has always been a somewhat greater interest and references to Sophia in literature, in artistic sources, in poetry, and various, because you might say that she was in the process of being reborn. Now, that being the case, I'll get ahead of myself with a funny line, which was communicated to me by a friend in New York quite a long time ago. He said, we are in grave danger of creating a female Jehovah, a Miss Jehovah. And I said, well, you know, that I really think that when it comes to Jehovah, one is enough in the world, and we don't need another one, whether male or female. But in any event, that was obviously a funny twist on the situation, but not entirely mistaken, because as I may have an opportunity to communicate from time to time tonight, we live in a civilization which for more than 2,000 years was under the aegis of a masculine monotheistic God, not just the Jehovah just mentioned. And so were new developments and discoveries along the line of what Jung would call the God image will tend to conform to that. And we will see also as we speak about the development of the various feminine deific figures, that some sort of the monotheistic and masculine conditioning of religious lore has been with us ever since a Jewish heresy that came to be called Christianity took over most of Europe and had dominated the religious scene, practically up to the present time, if it were for the secularization with its accompanying features of atheism, which just means no God, that has somewhat cooled that situation. So in any event, it's important to keep in mind that whenever deific figures are discovered or written about or God forbid, channeled and things like that, they tend to conform even in spite of their own inclinations, as the French say, malgré lui, in spite of themselves. They tend to conform to the monotheistic image of the Jewish God, or the one who passed for the Jewish God for so long, namely the aforementioned Jehovah. Now, the revival of interest in the feminine God image, if we want to call it that, and various accompaniments with it, certainly did not go away. But as I mentioned, when it returned, it very often took on the monotheistic garb, which wasn't probably altogether helpful or altogether justified. One of the first of these was, believe it or not, in connection with the witches. Because back in earlier part of the century, maybe in the 1920s, 1930s or thereabouts, a British university professor, lady professor at London University, Margaret Alice Murray, came out with a book called The God of the Witches, which was followed a good many years later by witchcraft in Western Europe. And this created quite a bit of interest. Already Howard Phillips Lovecraft, that wonderful writer of, he was not, he was sort of the grandfather of the horror movie genre, the Stephen King of his day, back in the 20s and the 30s, mentioned Margaret Murray, but it wasn't until the 1950s or thereabouts when the book The God of the Witches got a big circulation, and a whole mythology in more than one sense came to the fore about an alleged very ancient, probably Neolithic or Paleolithic religion in the northern and western part of Europe and on the British Isles that allegedly worshipped a goddess, or the goddess as it came to be called. And that as time went on, and then eventually, of course, Christianity came to conquer the British Isles as well, that this cultus of the goddess and her followers went underground, but that it was the direct ancestor of all those poor people, primarily women, who then subsequently, quite a ways after Christianity and especially Protestant and Puritan Christianity took over England, were subject to all the persecution, some of which had even spilled over eventually to New England in the persecution of the witches. Now, I would be uttering an untruth if I said that Margaret Murray's books were not interesting. They were really interesting. At the same time, I would hesitate to say that there was a great deal of actual historical truth in them. But she was a historian, a reputable academician, and she did come up with various interesting data as well as speculations. Some of this revival of interest spilled over into other literature. I even remember one book that I really found exciting, although once again from a historical point of view quite lacking in accuracy, was a book that was kind of half historical novel. I can't really think of the author now, but which took this witch theory and sort of imported it into the actual history of England at the time of Henry VIII. And the thesis of that book was that Anne Boleyn was a witch. Well, a lot of people hated her, probably called her a witch, and that she, being a witch, came up with some kind of a magical procedure whereby she would be sacrificed, she would be executed, as she was, by the king, and that would act as a sacrifice that in turn would then facilitate the next wife in the great series of Henry's wives, the next wife to have a male child. And so that she offered herself as a human sacrifice. Very fascinating book, but utterly untrue. So, as I say, all kinds of strange ideas and projections onto history developed once the Sophia mythos found a gradual rebirth in Western culture. Now, what Margaret Murray's theory, which then stimulated an actual modern-day revival of what they were pleased to call the old religion, had among others brought in the idea that the old religion, as they would refer to it, the descendant of which was witchcraft, did have a god as well, but the god was subordinate to the goddess. Needless to say, the feminists, of course, were greatly pleased by this development and made, so to say, much of it. But so all of a sudden, there were contemporary witches in England, and they were led by a very interesting man. I never met him, although I corresponded with him, a man named Gerald Brousseau Gardner, who was a retired British colonial official who I think was stationed for quite a while in Malaysia and around there, and came back to England and was very interested in occult things. For a while he was an active member of Aleister Crowley's Auto Templi Orientis and things like that. And then he hit on the idea that he would revive witchcraft, very much on the basis of or using the patterns of the various and various descriptions that were present in Professor Murray's book about the witches. And that is how the still functioning modern Wicca people came into existence. Now, we are now in the 50s, shortly after, mid-50s, late 50s, shortly after I came to this country. And I did quite a bit of writing of a sort of semi-journalistic nature. I was writing for magazines. We had two magazines in the United States that both had a parapsychological and occult theme. There were Faith magazine and another one called Exploring the Unknown. Well, I wrote for both, and I enjoyed it a good deal. And once I read about the English witches, I obtained sufficient amount of information, so I wrote a really long article in Exploring the Unknown, which had some kind of a facetious title, Beware Witches at Work. You know, just like beware men at work when you are on the street. Well, that kind of created a bit of excitement. And here I was, I got a letter, big, large handwriting mailed on the Isle of Man. Not the Isle of Woman, no, but the Isle of Man. And because that is where Gerald Gardner owned a property called the Witches, which he named the Witches Mill, and which became the sort of the headquarters of what then came to be called the Gardnerian witchcraft. So he wrote a very nice letter to me. He said I was a fairly recently ordained priest at that time when that came out. So in all of my articles, it always had my picture with a clerical collar. I thought that'll surely frighten the witches. But he wrote and he said, well, I was something I never thought that clergymen would write so kindly about us witches. And I said, well, and then I wrote back to him, well, Dr. Gardner, you may not have thought so, but I have friendly feelings, and I'd like to study, what you're really into. So then, so this established an ongoing contact. In fact, I had a letter from Gerald Gardner very short time prior to his demise. He was writing to me that he was going on a tour with a ship, going somewhere, and that he was leaving the harbor, and that when he was done with that particular tour, he would write to me again. Well, he never was done with the tour because he died on the way, just had, something got to him. But in any event, it aroused, obviously, my ongoing interest in the Garnerian witches. But as I corresponded with various people and literature, because Gardner himself wrote, I think, 2 books. He wasn't a very great writer. It was Margaret Murray, the professor, who put the subject of the witches and of the old religion really on the out into the open. But Gardner actually organized a religion, based on the fact that in this religion the prime deity, the chief deity, was female, and was then from then usually referred to as the goddess. But she had a husband who was who appeared in a ritual context with the antlers of a stag, and whom therefore they equated with an earlier deity from Roman times called Cernunnos, the one with the horns. So it was Cernunnos and the goddess of the witches who presided over the various Sabbaths and Esbats. They had a whole calendar worked out. I mean, I must say that God bless those witches. They worked really hard on being witches. And once again, however, if you studied that literature with some degree of information about history and about the historical period that they refer to, you could see that, I would say a goodly percentage of the mythology and of the rituals were, as we say kindly nowadays, made up. So let me put it this way: I was amused by the whole thing, and I was nice to them, but what they had invented their own religion, but wouldn't own up to it. However, believe it or not, and I in those days, probably because I was sort of the young whippersnapper on the horizon who was writing articles and this and that, I would get strange correspondences from various people, and this one was not even the strangest of the lot. But believe it or not, after Dr. Gerald Gardner's demise, I think she was his successor, the witch who inherited his house on the Isle of Man was called, if you ever want to go there and do some witchy things, I think they are still there, was called the Witch's Mill. And the lady who held forth there, who went by the witchy pseudonym Lady Olwen, Lady Olwen was really Mrs. Wilson, but I understand that Lady Olwen sounds much better. So she wrote to me in behalf, supposedly, of their association of covens as to whether I would be willing to become their representative in the United States. And I wrote back, I said, well, I thank you and I feel honored, but I have other, I didn't use that expression, but that I have other fish to fry, and I'm not going to do that. But I just want you to know that if I had been thus disposed, I could have become the founder of Gardnerian witchcraft in the United States. And I turned it down. Can you imagine? What a story. And it was true. But while I did not, this was before my traveling days. But then one of my friends, now deceased, the late Forrest Barber, he liked to travel, and he went to the witch's mill, and he stayed there for quite a while, and he brought them my personal greetings and all of that, so that I did not completely lose touch with them. But let us say this is how the revival of modern day witchcraft occurred, or maybe if we say modern, that already indicates a revival. And it came at a time when at least a certain segment of society was becoming more and more interested in a feminine deity and a religion that would be organized around the feminine deity. So it was really a sign of the culture that the goddess image was coming and was forming. Although in the witchcraft manifestation, it did not really go very far. Gerald Gardner himself wrote a book called The History of Witchcraft, which again, these people had wonderful imaginations, but as I say, the historical relationship was rather scanty. Now, what we need to keep in mind at this point, and that's what I'm really trying to introduce to some extent this evening, as to were there really in history any female deities, and if so, how did they relate to the societies and so forth? Now, as far as, and I looked into it from a historical point of view quite thoroughly there for a couple of years, and I came to the conclusion that as far as discovered information is available to us, there never was a time with a religion which was presided over by one sole feminine deity. Feminine deities definitely were present throughout history, and I'll mention some of them. But the one where there was just the goddess simply did not exist. Now, of course, how can one tell whether a goddess exists or not? How can one tell about deities? If one sticks by historical evidence, then we don't find anything of that sort. But of course, behind all of this, and that is really the important issue in my mind, there are important factors that are of a different nature, because like in so many cases and with the various religions, there is a background, a religious spiritual tradition is somewhat like an iceberg. Only a little bit of it sticks out of the water, and the great mass of the situation is hidden. And so what is the great mass of the situation? The great mass is that there are supernatural beings, spiritual beings that have a contact with earthly existence in considerable numbers, and that when we take them into account, then the mythologies and the theologies of various people take on a somewhat different appearance. So let's put it this way. There is a realm of reality. There is a realm of life where there are deities, male and female. But it is not in physical reality, it is in psychic reality. No, but we also need to keep in mind that what we might call psychic reality and physical reality are not totally divorced from each other. And when something exists in the spiritual realm, which is in the soul realm, which is psychic, it will also affect and have some appearances and influences on the physical level. And so we cannot completely separate the two. And that is the reason why so many religions, some of them still quite active, have had and still do have both male and female deities. We also need to keep in mind that nowadays, I don't need to tell you that there is a great deal of talking and writing and jabberwocky about gender issues, and that somehow the existence of male and female at the biological level is not an isolated phenomenon either, but rather that when we have some information about and some insight into the vast realm of non-physical beings, then we discover that what is very prominently represented in the inner worlds is the principle of duality. This is the duality which formed the raison d'être, as we might say, the reason for being of alchemy. That it, or to put it in American colloquial terms, it takes two to tango. And these two, the two are polarities that relate to each other and in certain ways complement and supplement each other, and by way of their supplemental interaction, various important processes of a psychospiritual nature take place, including, if we take the mythos to its final conclusion, the production of something very great and very miraculous, namely the philosopher's stone, because there are also a masculine and a feminine spiritual entity which has various symbolic descriptions of the sun and the moon, and others interact with each other, and as the result of their interaction, new and interesting developments take place. Now, what we are, of course, as Harold Bloom, the late Harold Bloom now, had so accurately stated, we are all children of the Greeks, by which he meant that our culture, the Western culture, is a Mediterranean culture, and that the key factors, the key players, the original key players in that Mediterranean spiritual atmosphere were the Greeks. And so we need to perhaps take for a few minutes a look at Greek culture and its polytheistic view of the gods and the goddesses. Now, why did the Greeks and their relatives, because they themselves believed that they were originally Greeks from the Trojan Wars, namely the Romans, why did they have such a profusion of gods and goddesses? How did that come about? And one important issue that we have to remember is that the Greeks did not believe really in a radical, and that's really very important. They did not believe in a radical separation of the human and the divine. But they very, in my Gnostic view, very correctly, they believed that in the human, every human, there is the potential of the divine. And therefore, if a human rises to certain levels of psycho-spiritual attainment, becomes more than human. And they said that the first step of that is what they call the hero. So from an ordinary human, your next step, I don't like evolution. I like to pronounce it like the fundamentalist preachers on television, evolution. But let us say, will not evolve, but will come to the point where the human inwardly and in his total nature, in his psyche, can take a new step of development. Then the human becomes a hero or a heroine, not a drug heroine. And the important thing to remember there is that a hero, you look it up in any dictionary, a hero in the classical sense is someone in whom the heroic human virtues have risen to a certain level. So we have within us virtus, as the Romans called it, which I'm sorry to say for feminist ears really means a manly virtue, because it starts with vir. But I will not ask for any monopoly in virtue on the basis of my gender, so I'll just forget about it. But let us say there is a superhuman strength in the human being. And the superhuman strength can develop, can grow, can be nourished, can be exercised to the point that it actually does something that we talk about in modern depth psychology and elsewhere, that it produces a transformation. And that transformation, something happens that transforms the human into something else. And that something else is a hero in whom the heroic virtues of the soul, of the internal being, have taken over. When somebody gets to the point that within him or her how should we put it, the transcendent function, the spiritual strength takes over, then we have someone who is more than human. But still somewhere in the borderland. And that is the first grade, so to say, that the Greeks said that a human being achieves in the process of what? In the process of transformation, which they called really the changing into the divine, the apotheosis. We are destined for apotheosis, which literally means of becoming God. And so that's the first step. But the development does not stop there. Then comes a yet higher development, said the Greeks, and with them the Romans, which is that of a demigod or demigoddess. Now, demi means half, I don't quite know how, they have these big bottles that have called demijohns. So I don't know what that means, that half a John had something to do with it, but demi means, even in French, it means half. So now the transformation has been so great that about half of the nature of that human being is divine. The human is still there. This is divine, and that is the demigod or the demigoddess. And finally, after some more transformation, it becomes a theos or a thea in Greek, or a deus and a dea in Latin, and then that is the ultimate stage of transformation, but it came from a human. Now, once again, you see, all right, those Greeks, they had a fabulous imagination. Yes, they did. I mean, look at the incredible myths and the Trojan Wars and all of that. They're the most fabulous storytellers that we know of. But there is more to it than that. These are people who had the magical imagination, which helps the individual to become more than he is, to be transformed into more than he is. And of course, this transformation has also been known both in Persia and in Greece and in Rome. It was a universally known word as magic. Why? Because the very word mag is the delineation of greatness, and magic is changing something, or in the best case, changing yourself into something greater than it is. Magia. And so the divine magic, theurgia, the divine work, that's a Greek too. The theurgy has to do with this kind of step-by-step transformation of the human into something greater and greater and greater. Now, that is, and you know, to this day, the Greek Orthodox Church refers to the highest point of salvation as theosis, becoming divine. Now, if you ask a Greek Orthodox priest, I have, and I wished I hadn't, from behind his big beard, he answers, well, humans don't become gods. That's a pagan idea. But it's actually implicit in the theology that we can reach a kingdom which is so far beyond the human that in ancient days it was referred as like Geoffrey Hudson's book, The Kingdom of the Gods. So, hero, demigod, and God, and of course their feminine counterparts. And this is of very great importance because it's based, when you look at it closer, it's based on the notion that within us, little humans who toddle around here on earth and do various silly things and so forth, that within us is a potential, and that potential is deific. It eventually raises the human spiritual nature to a level of attainment that is very, very different to what we are used to. So that we are really developing into a species, a spiritual species, that is other than the one that we are now. And that this being the case then creates a good many gods and goddesses. So if you ask, why did the Greeks have so doggone many gods and goddesses? Why? Because they believed in the possibility of a deific development, an apotheosis or a theosis of becoming divine. And this, I think, is of very great importance. Why did they have so many gods and goddesses? Because they had a lot of people. And that over the centuries and the millennia of Greek history, many of them developed into gods and goddesses and were now in the Elysian fields, up above the mountains, higher even than Mount Olympus. That is where the gods and the goddesses are. And you know the gods, the Greeks valued happiness. In fact, there's a whole philosophy, eudaimonism, which means to cultivate a happy spirit. So I often go in my imagination, even though I have never been there in physically, to Greece in its ancient form, and walk below the mountains. The laughter of the gods comes from the top of the mountains, because there in the Elysian fields, there on the top of the mountains, there are the gods and the goddesses. And you know what they do? They're happy. That's the big difference between them and us. because we always find something to be grumpy about. At least I do. And we always find something for causes of unhappiness, because the way our consciousness interacts with the environment and so forth does that. But when these as Nietzsche, who was a classicist, he was a great scholar of Greek and Roman law. As Nietzsche wrote in German, das Menschliches, allzu Menschliches. The human, the all too human, is something that we can come out of. That is something that we can overcome. That is something out of which we can transform. And so that is the reason for the large numbers of who dwell in the Elysians. And the Romans, of course, as I say, were just really transplanted Greeks to begin with, because according to the legend which you have in the Aeneid, of course, the goddess Juno picked up some of the Greek ships that were there in the course of the Trojan Wars, and because she got angry at Aeneas, and she drove the ships over to the Italian peninsula, and there they were, of course, there are always people there when you arrive someplace. No place is empty, Everybody comes from somewhere, and no place is empty. This is a good thing to remember for anthropology. If you are looking for a place by continent or country or island or whatever, where you're going to be completely alone, forget it. You're not going to find it. The Etruscans, who were an interesting bunch of people too. The Etruscans lived in present-day Italy, and if you go up right outside of Rome, if you go up to Tivoli, which is a wonderful place around there, you see that the hillside, the mountains have caves in them, and in these caves, prior to the coming of the Romans, or maybe for some time thereafter, lived the Etruscan, we call the Etruscan witches, the Etruscan magicians, the soothsayers, the ones who saw the future, and one had to climb up the mountain and get to the cave, and then they would tell you a fortune. So the Romans, being descendants of the Greeks, brought some magic with them and found some additional magic on the Italian peninsula itself. But what is important to remember, therefore, that the divine and the human were not completely separate, but that there was a way of transgressivity, as we might call it, from one to the other. And that works both ways. Look at all the time that Zeus and all the rest of them, that they got bored up there in Elysium, and then they came down to have fun on Earth, usually with some human person of the opposite sex to them. But anyway, they have the freedom to move between the worlds, which we don't really have. We can gradually, and with a lot of effort and a lot of discipline, we can develop the deific faculties within ourselves. But we are not. We are different. Although eventually we join the kingdom of the gods. So when you translate the mythic truth into something that is more of rational or semi-rational nature, then what this declares is that humans are subject to transformative change in the direction of transcendence, in the direction of the gods. And that this is possible, and if the human really devotes enough magic to it, it can happen. And on the other hand, however, that the deified, the transformed, those who have undergone apotheosis are also not closed off from our world, and that they can appear. And this knowledge, this gnosis, was not done away with even with the coming of Christianity. If you look at various medieval chronicles and so forth, you find that spirits, angels, as well as demons, would appear, would walk down the city street. Why? Because they know how to do it. They are not locked up in a prison up there or wherever it is in the other world either, and they have the ability to interact with humans, and that is why, let's say, the people like the late Geoffrey Hodgson, whose visions are depicted in some of these stained glass windows, had written an entire book called The Kingdom of the Gods, and he wrote another very fine book which is called The Brotherhood of Angels and of Men. By men he meant women as well. So that there is a relationship between ourselves and these beings, many of whom may have experienced our condition. Haven't you ever said when you, we got a nice invitation or a nice present or something like that, you may have said to the inviter, "Oh, you're an angel." So because we have an angelic selfhood within us as well, and therefore let's say the rigid separation of the spiritual or the transcendental and the physical is not a helpful concept. And this is where, at least within the Grecian concept, and many others are very similar in nature. Obviously, the Romans had a very similar concept because they were Greeks to begin with, and so when politics got into the act a little bit later on, when the empire after Caesar Augustus was established, then it was possible for the emperor to nominate somebody to become a god. Yeah. Now, that didn't mean that they were now up in. They had to travel to Greece to Mount Olympus or something like that, but that because the emperor of Rome was so powerful that he could. That was the theory. Whether it really worked out that well, sometimes I'm sure it didn't. That he had the power to facilitate the transformation of an ordinary human into a deific being. I think in the I Claudius, which was a long television series, but which really is based on Robert Graves' writings on Claudius. There is a wonderful incident that that I always enjoyed, where Claudius's grandmother, who was the wife of the first emperor, and the old lady says to her grandson, "Oh, grandson, I so much would like to become a goddess." And he says, "Well, grandmother, we'll see what we can do about it. I can make you a goddess," because he was emperor already. So, which again it's burlesqued, and I doubted that such an encounter has ever occurred. It is burlesque, but it's based on this principle that people can change and join the kingdom of the gods. Now, all right, so let's say with some of the other polytheistic cultures, we can't be all that certain as to how the gods became gods. But we certainly, I think we know about Greece and Rome considerably. Now, actually, the greatly admired companion country was Egypt, which of course they all respected tremendously. And I would say it is not unlikely that a good many of the Egyptian deities, the lesser deities particularly, had been human at one time, and that they had been transformed into the gods and the goddesses. But we also need to remember, as it often happened, that beyond the ancient Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses, way up there was a supreme and secret god. Only some knew about him, and that was Amun. And some of the lesser deities were manifestations. Like Amun-Ra was the solar manifestation of Amun. But there's a supreme power that reigns above them all, and that is the god of the gods. That is how the Greeks saw it. And so, once again, humans, when they served the gods properly, could get closer to them and eventually move, so to say, into their kingdom. Now, I don't want to regale you with too much history, but let's say this is the basic pattern that does have variations, of course, but this is the basic pattern that prevailed and still prevails to a great extent among all the polytheistic religions, that is, religions that have many gods and goddesses. So to look down upon the polytheistic religions as some sort of primitive phenomenon is nonsense. That is definitely not the case. And so it was a very similar situation in Persia. But I don't want to go through all the countries because you really get bored. But the ancient Persians, again, had many gods, and they were called, or as they are still called in India, devas. And that is actually, Persia and Egypt were regarded with a great deal of respect and aspiration by others like the Greeks and the Romans. So they looked up to them. They were more advanced than they, and that was so that is why the devas were also very closely related to the humans, and very often humans would change into devas. Then the things. And we need to remember, for instance, that the ancient Persians in the Iranian plateau, that the ancient Persians were the ancestors of the people in India as well. That is why in India you still have devas. What happened at various points in history was that the Aryas, the noble people, moved, great many of them, not all of them, from Persia and ended up in the Indian peninsula. But they, let's say, they were also of that belief that they would become gods, and that they interacted with the deities at all times. And out of that interaction and that curious interactive relationship of humans and the gods, the incredibly complex Hindu religion came into being. Because the Hindu gods and goddesses have characteristics that are human. Now, you cannot find the Hindu scriptures that will say that Krishna was once a human, but he sure acted very human all along. So it's you can see by interaction and by reflection that the understanding there is also that the human and the divine are not forever separated, and that if the human acts more than human, the human can transform and join the kingdom of the gods. And so these are the underlying virtues of the various polytheistic religions. You see, when you have a monotheistic religion with one great big bearded god thundering up on Mount Sinai and so forth, then these things don't happen. The human and the divine are radically separated. But in the view of the ancients, there are crossovers, there are developments, and there are transformations. And this is very important to keep in mind, because if we change the scenario a little bit, we don't use the same words, we don't use the same terms, but still the same concepts. This is the essence of the esoteric tradition, that something transcendental, something divine, something not only God-like, but something that is a God, is in the human. It's veiled, it's concealed, it is hidden behind a curtain, but with the right kinds of life, with the right kinds of consciousness, with the right kind of desire and aspiration, that veil can be lifted and the God steps forth, comes forth. And so you see, it's still there when you come to, let's say, Christianity. What is Christianity based on? But on someone who, according to the Christian belief, was both God and man. The God-man, the Son of God. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, but, and isn't it true that wherever you look into the Christian literature and so forth, you encounter things, imitatio Christi, to imitate Christ. How could we imitate a God unless there is something akin, something deific inside of us. Now, of course, this should not lead to inordinate pride and exalting ourselves, but there is something mysterious there that, if attended to properly, has a deific future. And so in some of the great polytheistic religions, like that of the Hindus, which I say again, the people have come originally from Persia, so it has a close relationship. But you can see there too is that there is a crossover. For one thing, the Hindus have the concept of avatars. And what is an avatar? An avatar is a god who has become human. Krishna is an avatar. Rama is an avatar. They are the human manifestations of divinity. So the interaction between the two, the interconnection and the changes from one into the other are very frequently present. So now what we should keep in mind at this particular point is that where does the figure of Sophia, whom we are to address ourselves, fits in? Well, obviously, while the figure of Sophia in part came from a monotheistic background, the Jewish background, the Chokmah, the wisdom, that it is a being that is capable of manifesting at the human level, and that humans can be inspired and transfigured and transformed by it. So once again, it needs to be kept in mind that whatever you call them, we are in close contact with the kingdom of the gods and the goddesses. We are not that separate, and therefore when we encounter them in various ways, we can interact, we can ourselves help our deeper nature to undergo the kind of change that was called the apotheosis, the becoming of the divine. And now, what happens with monotheism? Well, for one thing, from time to time, within a generally polytheistic culture, the polytheistic religions outnumber the monotheistic religions. Why is this so? Because it is the presence of many deific beings is closer to experience than the one. In other words, right now in this room, there are spiritual beings. I wouldn't call them gods, although some of them might be. But we are always in the presence of transcendence. It may transcend us, but it is here. We are always in contact with a mystery. And that mystery, in turn, is the kingdom of the gods. In the Gnostic system, we are instructed, let us say, that we are in contact with a tremendous, huge, incredibly vast world of spiritual beings. These all or most of them would be called gods in a polytheistic system. And so we, with one part of our being, we relate to this greater world. And in one of the Gnostic scriptures, in the Bruce Codex, Jesus speaks to his disciples, and he sort of chides them that they don't have enough self-esteem. They don't realize who they really are, and says, "Know ye not that ye are all angels, all archangels, all the great invisibles, and all the gods?" You know, don't you know who you really are? And that is really the self-knowledge is not knowing that you know how to turn on a computer. You know, but self-knowledge is knowing who you really are, and who you are beyond the one whom you recognize. So you recognize yourself as a particular transcendental being, but when I have sort of envisioned this sometimes in my life as it's a movement, a journey, and you come to I have experienced that now and then. You come to a figure that stands there awaiting you, and when you come real close to it, it is yourself. It has your form. Then you go further, and there it is again, because these are the symbols of transformation. These are the symbols of moving into the kingdom of the gods. But in order to accept that, we have to have actually, this doesn't sound like a lot of humility, but you have to have a kind of subtle wisdom that allows you to do that, and to recognize your future, to recognize who you are changing into, to recognize your divine as well as your human self. And in order to acquire that talent, you have to have something that at times has been called wisdom. And that wisdom, in turn, which in Hebrew is called Chokhmah, that wisdom is the key to your transformation. It is the key to the gnosis. And if you acquire it, if you become affinitized to it, this wisdom can be of very great assistance to you. Now, you may recall that King Solomon of the Hebrews, a great mythical and historical character, King Solomon was regarded as the wisest man on earth. And if you look at the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, as it is called in the wisdom literature, I will only read a few sentences from it. You see that Solomon pays homage to somebody who instructed him, and that somebody was called wisdom. And wisdom in Greek is Sophia, and in Hebrew is Chokhmah. Let me see. Let me just read a bit. This is from the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, from the wisdom literature. It's a perfectly orthodox scripture. If you want to look for that, it says, "Wisdom, which is the worker of all things, taught me," says Solomon. "For in her is an understanding spirit, holy, one only, manifold, subtle, clear, undefiled, plain, not subject to hurt, loving the thing that is good, quick, which cannot be letted, ready to do good, kind to man, steadfast, sure, free from care, having all power, overseeing all things. This is still all one sentence. Overseeing all things and going through all spirits, understanding pure and most subtle. That's the sentence. For wisdom is more moving than any motion. She passeth and goeth through all things by reason of her purity. So let's see, here it is now. Here is the wisest man, Solomon, owns up to it. He is instructed by wisdom. And this wisdom is not to be seen as a quality, just a quality of mind, but it is somebody. It is personified. It is a mysterious personage that at the right time can come to people and make them wise. So it is Sophia. Now, why is it that the Sophianic figure, the wisdom which is almost inevitably feminine in nature, is so much has been exorcised or excised from the Judeo-Christian framework? Well, one reason for that being is that we need to reach out for that wisdom, and that wisdom has been, once again, if you look at it historically, I didn't mention that one. There is a book called The Great Angel. That is one of the most recent books along these lines. It's within the last dozen years or so. It's written by I couldn't find my copy in my untidy library, which is totally full of disorder. But it's a British biblical scholar, lady biblical scholar of some standing, wrote it, and what she has discovered, and she has very, very good evidence for it, what she has discovered was that there's a certain, that there was an earlier system of Hebrew theology than the one that we know now. In fact, she wasn't the only one. Earlier on probably the early 1970s, there was also another very interesting book. I'm mentioning these in the hope that some of you might find them and read them, although you won't find them in my library because they are there, but they are hidden away. Was called The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai. Now, people will pronounce him Patai, but he was not a Hindu, but, get this, a Hungarian. Raphael Patai had discovered by then already a great many remnants, a great many signs that at one time, in an earlier historical period, the Jewish religion had a very important feminine figure in it, and that is the one that he called the Jewish goddess. Now, in the more recent times, in the Great Angel, this thesis has been carried further, and that English scholar, also lady scholar in that case, she has actually discovered that in a certain early period of Jewish history, the order of how should I put it? It's difficult to tell. Many of you are familiar with Kabbalah. So the tree of life of the Kabbalah, the Etz Chaim, has been apparently there in somewhat different form for a heck of a long time. But that there came a certain time when sort of a very puritanical and very dogmatic bunch of rabbis took over, and they changed the order of the constituent portions of the tree of life, which was probably not called tree of life at that time around, so that that there was a time for a long time of really early Hebrew history when the highest component of the body of God, which is the tree of life, of the body of God, was feminine, was Chokmah. But that there came a certain development, a kind of an internal religious revolution, which is called the Deuteronomy Reformation, because that is when the book of Deuteronomy was written. And in the course of the Deuteronomy Reformation, the principle that was at the top of the tree of life, if you want to use that one, which was Chokmah, had been dethroned and put much further down on the tree of life. So this was the exile of Sophia in ancient Jewish literature, because Sophia is the Greek translation of Chokmah. So the present tree of life is not authentic. I knew that for a long time. You can work with it, but the original tree of life had as its supreme at the top, which now is scattered, the crown, had Chokhmah, the wisdom, and then later on so that is also, I think, of great interest, because it indicates, yes, Raphael Patai was right, there was a Hebrew goddess. And what this means is that the point that is closest to the utmost transcendence, to the Ein Sof Ur, was feminine and was called the wisdom. So there is the Hebrew Sophia, there is the mother of wisdom, as she originally was present even in this most direct and most devoted of all monotheistic religions. She was there because it is through wisdom, that the ultimate transcendence of the Ein Sof Ur comes down into the tree of life. So let's say these are interesting developments, because they indicate that the figure of Sophia, the wisdom, was not invented by the Gnostics, was not even invented by the Greeks, but it was an archetypal figure that was present and that had even been discovered. It's going back a lot of millennia in very early Judaism. So apparently there always was a wisdom, and that this wisdom being was feminine. Chokhmah is feminine. And this feminine wisdom was the one that would come and inspire people like King Solomon and others, and transfer her wisdom to them. So let's say the proposition that there is a close connection and a possibility of transiting from human to the divine is a very, very ancient one. It's present in many, many traditions. And also that the way that the human and the divine can join together, that the essence of divine consciousness comes into the human, is by way of a feminine principle, whether we call it Chokhmah or Sophia. So it's very, very ancient and is in many, many places. Now, of course, it had been suppressed, but there is evidence that it existed. And so what has been present in human consciousness can be in human consciousness again. And I know that I've been throwing around a lot of weird ideas this evening, and you will have to forgive me for it. I will probably do a better job next time when I come to Sofia. But what I was trying to indicate is that all over the world, in every culture, in every religion, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and you can also find elements of it in Mesoamerica and so forth. There was somehow the great polarity of the human and the divine, and the mysterious feminine wisdom that is able to join the two together and bring wisdom to the human and bring the human into wisdom. Now, it takes a lot of symbolism. It takes a lot of study. It takes a lot of imagination to see this in the various scriptures and so forth. But from where I am now, I am convinced that this is a most important message that has been hidden, sometimes on purpose and sometimes just by developments in the various religions, and that brings in that mysterious figure of wisdom which comes to the sages. After all, King Solomon was what in Spanish we would call muy hombre. All of those Hebrew kings, Mamma mia, what swingers they were. David, King David, King Solomon, all of them. Oh boy, a beautiful lady comes along, whether human or spirit. Aha! Well, so obviously the feminine wisdom came to the sages, the wise men, and inspired them and brought in various ways, her essence to them, and that therefore the interaction of the wisdom woman and of the human is one of the grand symbols of human transformation and human development. And the ones who came out with it very openly, and who of course therefore were suppressed and chastised and all that, were the Gnostics. But the Gnostics did not invent Sophia. The Gnostics picked up on this mysterious figure. They could find it in the Old Testament. The book of the wisdom of Solomon was certainly there already. They could find it in among the Greeks. They could find it among the Romans. Certainly with Isis the Glorious, they could find her in Egypt, always there. And that is the needed inspiration which makes for transformation, which brings out the slumbering, the latent divine out of the human and changes humans into the divine, makes us enter the kingdom of the gods, makes us be at Mount Olympus and in the great divine gardens where we don't have to we don't have to watch television, we don't have to pound the computer, but like the gods of old and the goddesses of old, we can laugh, we can laugh, we can laugh. Because the keynote of wisdom ultimately is happiness. Wisdom brings happiness. Wisdom brings humor. Wisdom brings laughter. And wisdom exorcises, chases out the sadness and the evil and the darkness of this world. And that is why we Gnostics have turned our attention to Sophia, the wisdom, and we'll try to look at the various important features of the Sophia myth. Again, why? Because something like the divine wisdom, and incidentally the book of the wisdom of Solomon and the other, the wisdom literature, was very highly regarded even in the Middle Ages. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was very greatly devoted to the book of wisdom, and of course they were able to say, look, yes, it's a woman, but isn't our Blessed Virgin Mary a woman? Isn't she related to it? Well, sure. So let's say the return of the feminine into religion, at least in the West, had a great deal to do with the various, often incremental rediscoveries of Sophia. And so I know that this was somewhat of a difficult subject for me as well, but I hope that at least, if not with the words, but at a feeling level, I was able to convey to you the fact that after many, many years, I have come to discover, what I feel is a discovery, that we are an unobstructed, not universe, much more than that, an unobstructed reality within which the great lady, the lady of wisdom, whether she is called this or that, is always present, and that with her inspiration, with her guidance, we shall also join as fully transformed beings the kingdom of the gods and goddesses, and be joyous and happy and accomplished and holy forever. So I hope this wasn't too weird for you, and let me say that is why it is so important. You say, well, what about wisdom? Anybody can be a wise guy. Yeah? No. There is a kind of wisdom that is the key to everything. There is a kind of wisdom which is the promise, the greatest promise, and the promise, moreover, that with God's grace and with our doing will be a promise that will be fulfilled. Thank you very much.